She didn't know how to put on crampons. The Sherpas told her, "If you go, you will die, and you will kill us too." May 19th, 2012. After 16 grueling hours of climbing, Shriya Shah-Klorfine reached the summit of Mount Everest. An inexperienced climber from Canada who couldn't tie basic climbing knots, who had to be taught how to cross ice ladders at base camp, who was warned repeatedly that she wasn't ready. But she pushed on anyway, driven by a childhood dream. Her moment of victory lasted minutes. What happened next on the descent would prove the Sherpas tragically right. This is the story of how determination without preparation turned deadly, and why 2012 became one of Everest's deadliest seasons in history. The mountain that never forgives. Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth, has long represented the pinnacle of human ambition. But for all its glory, the mountain is unforgiving. A silent giant that has claimed the lives of over 300 people who dared to challenge it. Since Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay first reached the summit in 1953, Everest's history has been written in both triumph and tragedy. The 1996 disaster remains one of the most infamous. A deadly combination of overcrowding, a late start, and a sudden storm led to 8 deaths, including experienced mountaineers like Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. In 2006, David Sharp, a British climber, was left to die alone near the summit after suffering from severe frostbite and exhaustion. Over 40 climbers passed by him, too focused on their own survival to offer help. More recently, 2019 saw one of the deadliest seasons in years, with 11 climbers losing their lives. Among them was American Dr. Donald Lynn Cash, who collapsed after reaching the summit and could not be revived. The increased fatalities were largely attributed to overcrowding and the growing number of inexperienced climbers attempting the ascent, often guided by low-cost operators prioritizing profit over safety. These tragic tales share a common thread: the dangerous allure of Everest, which draws both seasoned mountaineers and those with little experience, lured by the promise of standing on top of the world. For many, this dream turns into a nightmare as they face the mountain's harsh conditions, unpredictable weather, and the physical toll of climbing in the death zone above 8,000 meters. The commercialization of Everest has made it more accessible than ever, but at a steep cost. Many climbers arrive at base camp with only basic experience. The influx of such climbers has turned Everest's once sacred summit into a crowded, dangerous bottleneck where one climber's mistake can spell disaster for many. Shriya Shah-Klorfine was one such climber. The dream. Shriya Shah-Klorfine was driven by an unshakable determination to stand on top of the world. Born in Nepal in the shadow of Everest, Shriya had dreamed of climbing the mountain since she was a child. Her father had taken her on a helicopter tour over Everest when she was just 9 years old, and the sight of the majestic peak left a lasting impression on her young mind. She knew then that one day she would climb to the top. Her family moved from Nepal when she was young, and Shriya spent most of her childhood in India before traveling the world. Eventually, she settled in Canada after meeting her husband, Bruce Klorfine, while working on a cruise ship. The couple married and moved to Toronto, where Shriya built a successful career as a businesswoman. She worked as a fashion buyer, ran an importing business, and even had a stint in politics, running as a candidate in the 2011 general election. Shriya was known for her passion and determination. Whatever she set her mind to, she pursued with relentless energy. So when she told Bruce one day that she wanted to climb Everest, he wasn't entirely surprised. However, he was concerned. Shriya had no mountaineering experience, no training in high-altitude climbing, and no background in extreme sports. Climbing Everest was one of the most dangerous undertakings in the world, and it seemed like an impossible goal for someone with her lack of experience. But Shriya was undeterred. Once she had made up her mind, nothing could change it. The preparation, that wasn't. She began training in earnest, setting her sights on reaching the summit within a year. Her training regimen included hiking in rural Ontario, rock climbing at a local gym, and lugging a 40-pound backpack up the stairs of her high-rise apartment building. But despite her efforts, she still lacked the technical skills and experience needed to tackle Everest's formidable challenges. To raise funds for her expedition, Shriya organized several fundraising events. She rented mountaineering gear for publicity photos and even photoshopped herself in front of an image of Everest to create a poster that she displayed at her events when she finally arrived. At base camp, she presented herself as a seasoned adventurer, sponsored by various companies and ready to conquer the mountain. If you enjoy thoughtful stories about the world's most extreme and mysterious places, consider subscribing. New stories every week. But the reality was far different. She was a novice climber embarking on one of the most dangerous journeys in the world with little more than sheer determination and a dream. Shriya found an expedition company, Utmost Adventure Trekking, that was willing to take her on as a client despite her inexperience. They accepted her money and allowed her to join the team. And so, in 2012, Shriya Shah-Klorfine set off on her journey to climb Mount Everest, determined to fulfill the dream she had carried with her since childhood. Little did she know the mountain would test her in ways she could never have imagined. Base camp, the reality sets. In the trek to Everest's base camp was unlike anything Shriya had ever faced. The journey through the rugged Himalayan terrain was a grueling 2-week endeavor, stretching over 124 miles of steep trails, deep valleys, and precarious bridges. It was a test of endurance, one that would acclimatize her to the thin air that awaited her at higher altitudes. But this trek was merely the beginning, a prelude to the life-or-death battle that lay ahead. Arriving at base camp, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The camp was teeming with climbers from around the world, all sharing the same dream of standing on top of the world. But as the days passed, so did the idealistic allure of the summit. The atmosphere was tense, with every climber acutely aware of the dangers that awaited them. The weather in 2012 was particularly unforgiving, with unusual patterns that kept even the most experienced climbers on edge. For weeks they waited, watching the skies, hoping for a break in the weather that would allow them to make their ascent. Shriya's inexperience became glaringly apparent during her training sessions at base camp. Despite her unyielding determination, she lagged behind the others, struggling with even the most basic tasks. The experienced guides watched her with growing concern. While others battled altitude sickness, nausea, headaches, and the debilitating effects of low oxygen, Shriya seemed unaffected. But this slight advantage was overshadowed by her lack of essential mountaineering skills. She didn't know how to put on crampons, the spiked boots crucial for traversing icy terrain. She had to be taught how to cross the creaking, precarious ice ladders that spanned deep crevasses. If you enjoy thoughtful stories about the world's most extreme and mysterious places, consider subscribing. New stories every week. Chapter: The Warning. As the days turned into weeks, the conditions at base camp grew more challenging. The weather continued to worsen, forcing climbers to wait for the briefest window of opportunity to make their push to the summit. Meanwhile, the camp became more crowded with every passing day. Climbers who had been delayed by the weather were now bottlenecked, all vying for the same chance to reach the top. Among them were many inexperienced climbers like Shriya, who had the money to join an expedition but lacked the skills to navigate the mountain's deadly challenges. Russell Bryce, a veteran expedition leader with 4 decades of experience, was among those who watched the situation with growing unease. Known for his cautious approach and deep understanding of Everest's dangers, Bryce decided to cancel his expeditions that year. It was a controversial decision, one that left his clients, who had each paid $50,000 for the climb, disappointed and frustrated. But Bryce knew the risks were too great. The unpredictable weather, the overcrowding, and the looming threat of avalanches made it clear that this was not the year to attempt the summit. But Shriya was not deterred. Her guides, concerned for her safety, tried to warn her. They told her bluntly, "If you go, you will die, and you will kill us too." It was a stark and terrifying warning, but one that Shriya chose to ignore. She was steadfast in her decision, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. She refused to back down, despite the increasingly dangerous conditions. No. The Death Zone. On the evening of May 18, 2012, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Himalayas, Shriya set out from Camp 4 for her final ascent. It was 7:30 p.m., and the temperature had already plummeted. She was now in the death zone, where oxygen levels were so low that every breath felt like a battle. Her goal was the summit, just half a mile above her, but it was a half mile that would demand everything from her, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The climb was slow, excruciatingly slow. Climbers in the death zone move at a snail's pace, taking 1 or 2 steps, then pausing to catch their breath before moving again. The air was so thin that even the most basic movements were exhausting. Climbers were lined up one behind the other, all sharing the same narrow path, each relying on a single rope that could snap at any moment. If it did, they would all be sent plummeting down the mountainside. Shriya's progress was agonizingly slow. She was among the last in the line of climbers, inching her way up the mountain. The photos from that day are harrowing, showing a human traffic jam on the world's highest peak. Hundreds of climbers, many of them inexperienced, were backed up along the route, waiting for their turn to ascend. The congestion was more than just an inconvenience. It was deadly. The delays meant more time spent in the death zone, more time for the body to break down, more time for oxygen supplies to run dangerously low. As the night wore on, the temperature continued to drop, and the wind began to pick up. The climbers were now racing against the clock, battling both the elements and their own bodies. But Shriya kept going, driven by the dream that had brought her to this point. She had come too far to turn back now. As the sun began to rise, the reality of her situation became increasingly dire. The delays had taken their toll. The summit was still far off. Exhaustion was setting in. The mountain was testing her in every way, pushing her to her limits and beyond. And as the hours dragged on, it became clear that the summit was not the only thing at stake. Her life now hung in the balance. The summit, a fleeting victory. Finally, Shriya Shah-Klorfine had achieved what so many dream of but few ever accomplish. She reached the summit of Mount Everest, standing at the top of the world where the air is thin and the views are breathtaking. But in the unforgiving environment of Everest, the true challenge begins once you've reached the peak. The descent is often more dangerous than the climb. To descend Everest is to battle not just the steep, treacherous slopes, but also the body's rapidly deteriorating condition. At those altitudes, above 8,000 meters in the aptly named death zone, the human body starts to shut down. Fatigue sets in deeply, making every step feel like a marathon. Muscles burn with lactic acid. The mind begins to fog over, dulled by exhaustion and lack of oxygen. Nador, the descent, where everything went wrong. Shriya's descent began just as the weather started to turn. The winds, which had been relatively calm during her ascent, now picked up, howling fiercely and cutting through her clothing with icy claws. The temperature plunged to a bone-chilling -40 degrees, a cold so intense it sapped the last of her strength. As darkness fell, the mountain transformed into a nightmarish landscape. The once stunning vistas were replaced by a black void, with only the narrow beam of her headlamp to guide her. Descending from the summit of Everest involves navigating some of the most perilous terrain on the planet. The Hillary Step, a nearly vertical rock and ice wall, is one of the most notorious obstacles. The Hillary Step is a 12-meter-high rock face that climbers must scale on the way up and carefully descend on the way down. It's a narrow, exposed section of the route with steep drops on either side, making it incredibly dangerous, especially for those who are exhausted after a long ascent. During the ascent, climbers use fixed ropes to pull themselves up the nearly vertical face. Descending the Hillary Step, however, presents a different kind of challenge. After hours of climbing at extreme altitudes, climbers are typically exhausted, their bodies and minds weakened by the lack of oxygen and intense physical exertion. As they approach the Hillary Step on the way down, they must carefully reverse the techniques they use to ascend. This means lowering themselves down the rock face while facing the mountain, controlling their descent with the help of the fixed ropes. This process is slow and arduous, with each movement requiring precision and care. A single misstep or loss of grip can result in a fatal fall. The path down the Hillary step is narrow, allowing only one climber to descend at a time. This creates a bottleneck, especially when multiple teams are attempting to descend simultaneously. Climbers must often wait their turn, standing on small, precarious ledges with little room to maneuver. On that day, as Shriya made her way down, the route was congested with other climbers, all trying to descend in the rapidly fading daylight. Each time Shriya needed to rest, the line behind her ground to a halt, increasing the risks for everyone. The collapse. As Shriya's strength waned, her pace slowed to a crawl. The Sherpas urged her on, knowing that time was running out, but her body was betraying her. After more than 20 hours in the death zone, her oxygen was nearly depleted, and she was struggling just to stay upright. Every step was a monumental effort, her legs shaking under the strain, her vision blurring from the lack of oxygen. The final stretch of the descent, known as the balcony, is a notorious section where many climbers have met their end. At 8,400 meters, it's an exposed, windswept ridge where the temperature plummets and the winds howl mercilessly. Shriya's body, already pushed beyond its limits, began to shut down. She could no longer stand on her own, collapsing into the snow, her strength finally giving out. The Sherpas tried desperately to keep her moving, but it was clear she could go no further. Shriya's pleas for help went unheard. On Everest, where every climber is fighting their own battle for survival, stopping to help can mean risking your own life. The Sherpas knew they couldn't carry her down, and Shriya could no longer walk. With no other options, they secured her to the rope line and, heartbroken, left her where she fell. The final photograph. Yet Shriya's story didn't end there. Another Sherpa, climbing with a different team, found her lying on the balcony, still clinging to life. He tried to revive her, urging her to move, but her strength was gone. Her body, starved of oxygen and ravaged by the cold, could no longer respond. She could only make faint, unintelligible sounds, the life draining out of her with each passing moment. The Sherpa, realizing there was nothing more he could do, took one final photograph of Shriya, wrapped in the Canadian flag she had carried to the summit. Then he continued his descent, leaving her to the mountain's unforgiving embrace. Shriya Shah-Klorfine's body would remain on Everest, a stark reminder of the perils that await those who dare to challenge its heights. She was one of 10 climbers who died on the mountain that year, one of the deadliest seasons in Everest's history. The aftermath, a harsh lesson, the tragedy of 2012 was a harsh lesson in the dangers of overcrowding, inexperience, and the unforgiving nature of Everest itself. As the story of Shriya's death spread, it sparked a fierce debate in the mountaineering community and beyond. Should there be stricter regulations on who is allowed to climb Everest? Should the number of permits be limited to prevent the deadly traffic jams that had contributed to so many deaths? These questions remain unanswered. Yet as more and more climbers flock to Everest, drawn by the allure of standing on top of the world, the risks only grow. The mountain is more crowded than ever, and the dangers that claimed Shriya's life are now more pronounced. Inexperienced climbers, enticed by the promise of adventure and the glory of the summit, are putting themselves and others at risk. And as long as the mountain remains open to all who can afford the journey, the tragedies will continue. What went wrong? Shriya's story raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility, preparation, and the ethics of commercial mountaineering. She was warned, repeatedly, by multiple experienced guides and Sherpas who could see she wasn't ready. If you go, you will die, and you will kill us too. That warning couldn't have been clearer, yet she went anyway. Some might call this determination, others would call it recklessness. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Shriya had a dream, a powerful, lifelong dream, born from a helicopter ride over Everest when she was just 9 years old. That dream consumed her, drove her, defined her final years. But dreams alone aren't enough on Everest. The mountain doesn't care about your dreams, your determination, or your passion. It only cares about your skills, your preparation, and your judgment. Shriya lacked all three. She couldn't put on crampons without help. She had to be taught basic ladder crossing techniques at base camp. She had less than a year of training for one of the most dangerous climbs on Earth. But she had money, and there was a company willing to take that money and let her climb. Chanur, the role of commercial operators. This raises perhaps the most troubling question. Should Utmost Adventure Trekking have allowed Shriya to join the expedition? Commercial mountaineering operates in a gray area of personal responsibility and professional ethics. On one hand, adults should be free to take risks, to pursue their dreams, to make their own choices, even if those choices might kill them. On the other hand, expedition companies have expertise that their clients lack. They know the mountain, they know the risks, they know when someone isn't ready. When Russell Bryce canceled his expeditions in 2012, he lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. His clients were furious, but he made the call because the conditions weren't safe. Utmost Adventure Trekking made a different call. They took Shriya's money and let her climb, despite clear evidence she wasn't prepared. Did they fail in their duty of care? Or were they simply respecting her autonomy as an adult, making an informed choice? The answer likely depends on what you believe about personal responsibility versus professional gatekeeping. What's undeniable is that Shriya died, and her death was preventable, not by better weather or luck, but by better judgment about whether she should have been there in the first place. The Sherpas who warned her. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Shriya's story is the Sherpas who knew exactly what would happen. They told her she would die. They told her she would endanger them. They were right on both counts. When Shriya collapsed on the balcony, unable to continue, the Sherpas faced an impossible choice: stay with her and likely die themselves, or leave her and try to survive. They chose survival, and they've had to live with that choice ever since. This is the burden that Commercial Everest places on Sherpas. They're expected to compensate for their clients' lack of skill and experience, to get them up and down safely despite inadequate preparation. And when that becomes impossible, when a client is so unprepared that saving them would mean dying with them, Sherpas are forced to make choices that will haunt them forever. Shriya's death wasn't just her tragedy. It was a tragedy for everyone involved, for the Sherpas who warned her, for the Sherpa who took her final photograph, for her husband who supported her dream despite his concerns. The commercialization problem. Shriya's story is a symptom of a larger problem. The commercialization of Everest has made the summit accessible to people who have no business being there. In the early days of Everest climbing, attempts were made by small teams of highly experienced alpinists. If you were on Everest, it was because you'd spent years or decades preparing, climbing progressively harder mountains, developing the skills and judgment needed to survive. Now, you can pay $30,000 to $100,000 and join an expedition with minimal experience. Companies will provide Sherpas to carry your gear, set your ropes, even help you climb. Some clients are essentially dragged to the summit by their guides. This isn't entirely bad. It's democratized Everest in some ways, allowing more people to achieve something extraordinary. But it's also created a situation where the summit is crowded with climbers who don't have the skills to handle problems independently. When things go wrong, and on Everest, things often go wrong, these climbers become liabilities, not just to themselves, but to everyone around them. The 2012 season that killed Shriya also killed 9 others. The 2019 season killed 11, many of them trapped in traffic jams near the summit, burning through oxygen while waiting for inexperienced climbers ahead of them to move. How many of those deaths could have been prevented if there were stricter requirements for who's allowed to attempt Everest? Never true. What should change? After every deadly Everest season, there are calls for reform. Stricter permit requirements, proof of climbing experience, limits on the number of climbers. Nepal has implemented some changes, requiring proof of high-altitude experience, limiting permits slightly. But enforcement is inconsistent, and the economic pressure to issue permits is enormous. Everest climbing generates tens of millions of dollars for Nepal's economy. Permit fees alone bring in over $5 million annually. Shutting off that revenue stream would hurt one of the world's poorest countries, so the permits keep flowing, the crowds keep growing. And every few years, there's another deadly season that sparks another round of debates about reform. What would meaningful reform look like? Mandatory proof of previous 7,000-meter or 8,000-meter summits before attempting Everest, skill assessments at base camp before climbers are allowed to continue, significant reduction in the number of permits issued each season, holding expedition companies legally liable for taking on dangerously unprepared clients, creating alternative routes to spread out climbers and reduce bottlenecks. But each of these reforms faces obstacles: economic, political, logistical. And so, Everest remains what it is, a mountain that's simultaneously too accessible and too dangerous, where dreams and determination collide with inadequate preparation and unforgiving reality. Shriya's legacy. Shriya Shah-Klorfine's body remains on Everest, somewhere on the balcony, still wrapped in the Canadian flag from her final photograph. She's one of approximately 200 bodies still on the mountain, climbers who died pursuing their dreams and whose remains couldn't be recovered. Some have become landmarks. Green Boots, a climber who died in 1996, was visible in a limestone cave on the northeast ridge for decades. Sleeping Beauty. Francis Arsentieff, who died in 1998, lay on the mountain for years before finally being moved. Shriya has become another name in Everest's grim catalog, a cautionary tale about determination without preparation, about dreams pursued beyond the limits of ability. Her story is told in mountaineering forums, in documentaries, in articles like this one. It's used to illustrate the dangers of commercial Everest, the importance of honest self-assessment, the tragedy of preventable deaths. But was her death truly preventable? She was an adult who made her own choice. She was warned, clearly, explicitly, and chose to ignore those warnings. She had a dream and pursued it with everything she had. Is that admirable or reckless, brave or foolish? Perhaps it's both. Perhaps the line between determination and delusion, between courage and recklessness, is thinner than we'd like to admit. What's certain is that Shriya Shah-Klorfine died doing what she dreamed of since she was 9 years old. Whether that makes her story tragic or triumphant depends on what you believe about how dreams should be pursued and what price is acceptable to pay for them. Tarpifra. Final thoughts. Everest had claimed another life, and the world was left to wonder how many more would follow. The answer, unfortunately, is many. As long as the summit remains accessible to anyone with money, as long as commercial operators prioritize profit over safety, as long as climbers believe determination can substitute for skill, the tragedies will continue. Shriya's story isn't unique. It's a pattern that repeats every season. Inexperienced climbers, inadequate preparation, warning signs ignored, preventable deaths. The mountain doesn't judge. It doesn't care about your story or your dreams or your determination. It only cares about whether you have the skills, experience, and judgment to survive. Shriya didn't. And now, she rests on the mountain she dreamed of climbing, a permanent part of Everest's tragic history. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Hit subscribe if you want more content like this, and let me know in the comments, where is the line between pursuing your dreams and taking unacceptable risks? See you in the next one.